Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our next event from the Taiwan Studies Program Book Talk Series. My name is James Lin. I'm an assistant professor of international studies here at the University of Washington. And today, our honored guest is Professor Scott Simon. Professor Simon is professor of sociology and anthropology and co-holder of the chair of Taiwan Studies at the University of Ottawa. He earned his PhD from McGill University and has lived in Taiwan for 10 years, regularly returns for his field research. His research interests include Indigenous rights, developments, the contribution of Taiwan to the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan's international status, and Canada-Taiwan relations. He has written 4 books and numerous articles about Taiwan. He does policy-oriented research as a member of the Center for International Policy Studies and the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, and as senior fellow at Ottawa's Macdonald Laurier Institute. This afternoon, we have the honor of hearing Professor Simon talk about his most recent book, Truly Human, Indigeneity and Indigenous Resurgence on Formosa, published by University of Toronto Press this year. In fact, I believe we may be the first to hear about this book because the book actually isn't even off the press yet. So it'll be published next month. So we have a very unique first preview, which I very much look forward to hearing about. So without further ado, let us welcome Professor Scott Simon. About 45 minutes for talk, and then 40 minutes Q&A.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you everybody for setting this up and for coming. So Ian, thank you very much for putting everything together and the taking care of the IT and everything. Thanks just for everybody who's here today. My cousin Brian Thompson is here as well, which makes me really happy. So thank you for coming, Brian, and James walking me over from the class that we just did, and Ellen and Jeff is here, and so lots of people are here. So thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be back in Seattle, which is a very important place for me, and many of you saw me here just a few months ago at the Taiwan World Congress. So I wanted to talk today about my book, Truly Human, Indigeneity and Indigenous Resurgence on Formosa. Every word in that title has a meaning. I think we'll get through that. But how did I get to this book? And basically, I think that I'll start by just talking about the time that we're living in. We live, first of all, in a time of Indigenous resurgence. I think at the University of Ottawa and Canada in general, it's very important. We have very protocols about land recognition and so forth. And just this past March 30th, there was a big news, which has been talked about a lot in Canada, I'm sure it has been here as well, that the Vatican repudiated the 500-year-old doctrine of discovery, which had been used around the world. And in my book, I'll talk about it a bit, including on Formosa, to justify appropriation of indigenous lands by so-called Christian explorers. And so getting rid of that doctrine of discovery was something that Native people in this continent wanted to do for a long time, and it has happened. We also are living in a time of unprecedented climate change, which I think we all are seeing quite frequently, that's caused by the way of life that's developed from the whole process of colonialism, and which has accelerated globally since the 1950s. Recently, some indigenous people, like Red Nation here in the United States, published in 2020 a book called The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth, saying that indigenous teachings are needed to solve our climate change challenges, and that we need to abandon some of our habits, especially the idea that we have to always have economic growth. We can't have degrowth, we have to have growth every year. And the indigenous are teaching us that by abandoning those habits, we can preserve the conditions for life on this earth. And so one of the teachings in the part of Canada that I'm in is about the seventh fire, and that there were these prophecies, and that the non-indigenous will learn about their ways of life, and then either there will be mass destruction or the eighth fire will be lit. And so there's a choice that we are at. So that's the teaching from this continent. But that's the context in which I wrote the book Truly Human. It's based on research that I did from beginning in 2004 in communities that now call themselves Sediq and Truku. And I did the writing. I started at the University of Heidelberg in 2016, and then I spent a year in Japan from 2017 to 18, working on the same book at the National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka. And also did some research on Japan while I was there. But I finished the book and I kind of reoriented it towards indigenous resurgence during the pandemic when I was stuck at home near the Gatineau River on Anishinaabe Aki territory of the Algonquin people during the pandemic. And so that's where it's coming from. The title Sediq Balai is my last book was called Sediq Balai, where I used the name in the Sediq language. This time I'm using the English. It can be translated as truly human. And so that actually is a translation from a Sediq word. But anyway, here's the book. In Truly Human, Indigeneity and Indigenous Resurgence on Formosa, with a cover by Biruan, which one of the people I work with in Nanto introduced me to this young artist, and she made that cover for me, along with the illustrations within the book, which I think are an important part of the book. So we have the shishil, the bird that they use as divination for hunting. We have the hunter with his hunting dog. Lots of little details in there. There's the Pusu Qhuni, where the first humans emerged from the earth at the beginning of time. There's the Jiwang Presbyterian Church, the Asia Cement, the Japanese police station from which the Musha incident happened, and so forth. So that's that. So basically the word truly human. Now why truly human is such an important part of that. And that actually comes from some reflections that I had after a discussion, a meeting in a Zaho Dian, in a little store in Nantou, in the town of Guruban. And the elderly man who ran it gave me a teaching. And so I think I'll read just a little bit from the book there. And so now I have a reading here. The initial inspiration for this book from the preface here was sparked by a conversation with an elder shopkeeper in Guruban, a rice farming village in central Taiwan. It was my third year of research on indigeneity and development in Taiwan. At the time, local leaders were lobbying their government for legal recognition as an indigenous group and had decorated the roads across the township proclaiming their national identity. Frustrated by being classified as part of a larger group known as the Atayal, they imagined a confederation of villages who spoke the closely related languages or dialects of Truku, Tikadaya, and Doda. Because all three of those languages in the Tikadaya village of Guruban used a very similar term, Sediq, to mean human, they proposed that the new indigenous nation would carry the name Sediq. The shopkeeper suddenly said to me, "Have you seen all those flags along the side of the road with the word Sediq printed all over them? Those politicians are hoping to make new positions for themselves by calling us Sediq. Sediq is not an appropriate term for an ethnic name that is meant to categorize and divide people. That is too narrow-minded. It just means human being," unquote. Pointing his index finger to my chest, he said, "You too are Sediq." He reminded me in Chinese that I may be a foreigner, but I'm also human. And as if to drive the point home, he repeated in Sediq, "Isu uri Sediq o." Those words lit a fire in my heart. After all, I was trained as an anthropologist. I had been taught to classify humans into discrete cultures and to believe that the socio-linguistic differences between them are the most salient ways of understanding ways of being in the world. He was telling me something different. He was telling me that even though we came from opposite sides of the planet, we were united by our common belonging to an ontological category called Sediq, which he repeated means human. In the immediate context, the important point was that a small group of political leaders were misguided to reserve this word, to label a group of maybe 10,000 people, somehow implying that everyone else was less than human. He even portrayed their political agenda as a moral failure. I left his shop wondering what it would be like to reflect upon what it means to be human, rather than what it means to be living culturally as Atayal or Sediq or Truku or even Taiwanese or Chinese or whatnot. I also realized that his understanding of Sediq as a universal ontological category had its own social and historical trajectory that overlaps with, but does not have the same ontological connotations as the English human or the Chinese zhen. I would spend years trying to reconcile this teaching, which I cannot ignore because it comes from a respected indigenous elder with my own support for indigenous rights movements, including the right of his community to join with others and seek legal state recognition as a Sediq nation. And so there was the initial conundrum that inspired the title of the book and much of the thinking within it. So there we have it. The title is the core of the book. Truly Human is a gloss on Sediq Belai. It also means like a real mensch, right? So the whole book really is about Gaya, the ancestral law of the Sediq, which contains teachings about how to become truly human. Indigeneity is the legal framework for indigenous peoples that has emerged because of negotiations between the state and indigenous peoples. Indigenous resurgence is about the cultural and political movement that is happening based on indigenous ontologies and ways of being. I use the word Formosa rather than Taiwan. I hesitated quite a bit about that one because I wanted to think about the island and its Sediq, its peoples, without confining our thinking within political projects like Republic of China and even Taiwan that were all brought in by settler populations. So here's actually the inspiration for the cover of that map of Taiwan. Came from the event that I participated in a long time ago. It's called the Urban Rural Movement. So this was actually in the summer of 2002. When they had indigenous activists and students coming together. And one of their activities was to draw a map of Taiwan, their imagined Taiwan. And they came up with this beautiful, beautiful map of Taiwan as this island with flying squirrels and wild boar and so forth. And so I think this is really a beautiful way of imagining Taiwan. And so that was the inspiration for the cover there. So anyway, so I read this book, and it's based on, so there's, first of all, there's the introduction, and then there's a history of the incorporation of indigenous peoples into what is becoming modern Taiwan. But then there were 5 essays, and we're going to go through all of those rather quickly here. Each one is constructed around a concept in Truku language. And so it really is kind of an essay about Gaya through those different concepts. Now, in terms of methods that I used, I've come across a rather big world. I call it phenomenological anthropology. And it's a big word. It's based on European philosophy. I don't want to get too much into the philosophy part of it. But what I find appealing to that is that it's a kind of anthropological or ethnographic style of being that it's not so abstract or metaphysical. It's quite the opposite. It's the recognition that rather than trying to look at cultures from above, kind of like a godlike perspective, that you want to just throw yourself into life with other human beings, become a human being among other humans, learn from them by being with them, working with them, sweating with them, drinking and eating with them, living as closely as possible as they do. And I was very fortunate that I was able to do that. The University of Ottawa let me go away for so long. I was very lucky that I was able to actually spend over 36 months of my life living in these communities with people. And so that's what it's about. And so I wanted to get some photos of things like that, and like the farming here. And that's because I was in Galuban and happened to be there when there was the rice harvest. And they needed to have 4 people to run this machine, and they only had 3. And I think that everybody was surprised when I just jumped up on the truck and started working with them. And that actually became a habit of mine. And even after my research project ended, I'd go back in summer vacation and help them with the crops. And because they really appreciated that. Because there were a lot of elderly people, in fact, who still have farmland and have no way of doing that work. And so that was something that was really good there. On the right-hand side there, you see me with my, I guess I'm his adoptive son in many ways. He's now passed on across the Rainbow Bridge, but this is Guhang. And he was there at this event that I described in the book. Maybe we'll have time to describe that today at the national park, the Taroko National Park, which kind of became a protest against the Taroko National Park because of the behavior of some of the people there. But he's there as a big man, and he led his group that was in a performance of Taroko culture there. So just hanging out with people and being with them and using one's own body to learn and not imagine that you're there to study some culture or cultural construction of something is the method that I used. So one of the big themes came up because after some years of working with people, they started to trust me. And so you can see this picture of the man's hands because he's doing something illegal. He's making a trap. But these people were sharing their lives with me as they go into the forest and they lay traps. And so the relationship they have with the forest is very important. I learned from them very much about their way of relating to mammals, birds, snakes, plants, etc. And that was something that was very, very important that they wanted to share with me. And that they wanted to share with me in a way that they knew I was hanging out with social activists a bit. They didn't, but they had their political claim to sovereignty that was in a way much stronger even than those urban-based social movements. So it was quite interesting to learn from them, and I've written quite a bit about hunting and trapping, and that's just because of the way it was. So hanging out with these elderly men mostly who are doing hunting and trapping. So anyway, the book itself is constructed around 5 concepts. They're all part of Gaya. There's a chapter on history, which we won't go into. I'll say a few words about each one of those 5 concepts. So anyway, the first slide here, and this is a photo that Dagis Bawan, who also has crossed the Rainbow Bridge, has provided me with. And it's a picture of Pusu Qhuni, which is a giant boulder in the very center of Taiwan. And for Sediq Truku people, this is really the center of the world. The story, it's an origin story, is that at the very beginning of time, at this particular rock, there was an earthquake and it split open. And from the rock emerged 2 men and 1 woman. And one of the men looked out at the world and saw the mountains and the forests and the rivers and the birds and the deer and all of these beautiful things. And he said, "This is wonderful. It's life. I want to be a part of this." And so the other man, however, looked at this world and he said, "This is horrible. There are earthquakes. There are typhoons. There are epidemics. Everybody is dying. You have to hunt and kill animals in order to survive. Terrible. I want to know nothing about this world." So he turned around and went back inside the rock. And then there was another earthquake and it closed and he was sealed inside the rock for eternity, whereas the man and the woman outside became the ancestors of all of humanity. And Presbyterian pastor Wadanjiro, he tells me, this is the true site of the Garden of Eden. And so here we have the story of Pusu Qhuni. And the people that I study, I think it's far better to think of them as the people of Pusu Qhuni than to think of them in terms of the ethnic identities that state-based politics has brought us. There are other ways of thinking about them. They often use, some of the older people use the metaphor of the taro. And so the taro with its sprouts that come off, and they refer to the ones at Nanto in the central mountains as the chinasari, the old taro. And the ones that sprout out going to Hualien are the kansari, the taro sprouts. So it's like a relationship that they have. So there are lots of stories. The Truku eventually made their way across the mountains along 3 different watersheds. They became the people that are Truku, Dekadai, and Doda, 3 dialect groups. And then in 2004, the ones in Hualien became the Tailukatsu, Truku, and the ones in Nanto became Sediq. So there was this whole process of name rectification. So I wanted to think about all of that and what it means. But we start with the source here, which is really their source of where did humans come from. And so I have 5 different chapters, and I could very easily spend the rest of the afternoon talking about any of them. But one of the first ones that I worked on was this concept of samat. Samat, because we're thinking really about the relationship here between humans and other beings. And the relationship that the Truku and Sediq, they have with the natural world is so important that when I first arrived in that first Truku village in Hualien with a student from NTU and a graduate student from the University of Ottawa, we were 3 of us. The first thing that they did on our first day, they said, you have to have Truku names. And they said, we don't know you. You just arrived here. So we're not going to give you real Truku names yet. We have to wait, and you have to earn the right to have a Truku name. But in the meantime, we'll give you names that are based on the names of animals in our language. And so they referred to the student from National Taiwan University, who is now a professor at National Tonghua University. And they said, this guy here with his little mustache and beard, he looks like the whisker of a flying squirrel. So we're going to call him Labit. And they took a look at my student from Canada, from Nova Scotia, and they looked at him and they said, your face is kind of long. So you kind of look like a Munchak. We're going to call you Munchak. The word is Bada. And then they said to me, you're the professor. So you're the biggest one here. And so we're going to call you the bear. So you are Gumai, the black bear of Formosa. So they gave us these names based on animals. And I think that really shows the strong affection that they have for the animals of these mountain forests, which are their mountain forests. And so they gave us those names. I eventually, after several months, they gave me the name Walis Wadan. And that was the case. They took me to the neighboring village where there was a shaman, and she is able to communicate with the spirits. And she has a bamboo stick. They have called a baran. They have a ceremony. She just did a ceremony. She consulted them, and if it falls from the hand, the answer is no. And if it sticks to her palm, then the answer is yes. So she asked if I could have a name, and she chose the name after getting permission to do so. She called me Walis Wadan. And she said when she was a young girl and in school during the Japanese period, there was a young guy there that she said he liked to study Japanese, and he was very good in school and liked books. And so kind of like you, and his name was Walis Wadan. So we're going to call you Walis Wadan. So anyway, there's this sama is very important. Now, later on, after the development project, when I started doing work on ethnobiology, one of the methods that I used was to do a free listing. So I would talk to people and ask them to name all of the examples they know in different cognitive domains. So I would say, what are all the baheni, what are all the birds that you know? And what are all the samat that you know? And samat's kind of a difficult word to translate. It doesn't really mean animal. The word for domestic animal is danabakan, which means those that we feed. Samat really refers only to wild animals that's a really poor translation, but it's the animals of the forest that one would hunt. And so actually some people were really scared when I asked them the question, what are all the samat you know? And they would say, shh, we'll go inside and talk about that, because the hunting is illegal. And they were afraid that the wrong person might hear them talking about the animals. And I'm just asking for the names of animals. But some people were sensitive about that. And so I kind of begin and end that chapter talking about the case of a hunting case in which a hunter had been arrested. And there was it actually ended up with a decision in the Constitutional Court of Taiwan and about the legality of hunting. But I started and ended with that, and then explore all of these different dimensions of their relationship with wild animals. There are a number of different ways to go off into that. It's a whole universe that they go into when they go hunting. And so they step into the forest. Some of them, the more traditionalists, will do a ritual when they enter the forest. And so they may leave some sacrificial goods. They might put a betel nut and some cigarettes and some rice wine and say the right words. And then they can go into the forest. Some of them are Presbyterian or Catholic, and they'll say a prayer instead. But they're always quite aware that they're entering into a different realm of being when they go into the forest. And it's a very special place. And so they go in there. Traditionally, they would take dogs. Nowadays, in the past, they might be able to take a whole hunting expedition with dogs. Now that they still like to have hunting dogs and raise them, but they might just go into the mountain with one dog. A lot of hunting goes on at night. There are many different kinds of hunting that go on. The elderly people, like the picture I just showed, they like to use traps. And so they put out the traps. And then there's the question of how to know if an animal has been caught or not. Really, trappers should go out and inspect their traps every day so that the meat doesn't get eaten by another animal or so that it doesn't go bad. They don't always feel like they have the time to do that, but sometimes their ancestors will give them a dream. And then that means that there's something in the trap. And so they would tell me stories about their dreams. So one man said he dreamt he had sex with a woman. And so that was, oh, I got it. And he went and there's an animal in his trap, right? So these are the things that happen. There's also more of a historical practice with the bird that's on the cover, which has become a national symbol. That's the shishil. And so historically, when they went hunting in the daytime, they would have a practice in which they would go into the forest. And the story that most people tell is that you walk on your path, and if you see the shishil on the right-hand side of the path, it's a good sign that you're going to catch whatever you're going for. And if it's on the left-hand side, it's a bad sign. You might as well just go home. And if the bird is agitated and flying in front of you, then that means something very bad has happened in the village, so you should go home. And so that's a very bad sign. So there's a very rich culture of living with animals in the forest. And I started with that because I think it really is a way in which they really identify their life, their sovereignty, their land. I took this picture here because the hunter said to me, he had on his back and he said, Scott, he said, what? He said, take a picture of this and then tell people, show it to people. So I took a picture of that. And Gaya, the law has a lot to do with the way that people eat animals. And this particular muntjac was something that they took. And so in the book, I talk about the ethical considerations and the way that people talked about whether or not they should have hunted this particular animal, which wasn't a trap, and then what happened to the meat. But it's all in the book. I do want to touch on these because there are 5 concepts to go through. The second one, there's a whole chapter about Gaya. Gaya is, we could gloss it again, these words don't really translate too well, but it would be glossed as headhunting. It's really difficult to call it that. In Chinese, 出草. And I kind of talk about the difference between Gaya and 出草, because 出草is like this, it's the position of the person having their head cut off. So it's the Chinese person who has somebody rushing out of the grass to cut off their head. Gaya means, because in their language, the word the prefix it makes it into put something into action. So implementation of Gaya, implementation of the law is Gaya. It can also mean becoming. So, but headhunting is really a problematic issue in Taiwan, because there was the long story about Han Taiwanese people using stories about headhunting to label indigenous people as being violent savages. And so there's the story of Wu Feng and the URM movement I showed the picture of at the beginning. One of the first things they did was they toppled a statue of Wu Feng and got the story removed from education. And so it's very, very sensitive to talk about headhunting, but they do it all the time. And I start the chapter with a conversation or a discussion. We're drinking beer, and somebody shares beer from a glass with me, and they like to put their lips together and then drink together from the same cup. And then somebody put a cigarette in my mouth, somebody put some food in my mouth, and then somebody said, it's a good thing you came here now, because if you came here 100 years ago, we would have to kill you before we put these things in your mouth, because there were these rituals of how they would treat the heads that were taken in these ceremonies of Gaya. And so they like to talk about these things in their own way. And I make the point in the book that it's really important that they are the protagonists in their stories. So the Wu Feng is a bad, it's really a racist story, because it's the Han people who are the heroes, and it portrays them as savages. But they have really, in a more postmodern age, really affirmed Gaya and in a very positive way is what they've done. Sometimes you see in public ceremonies that get public funding, they'll recreate this in some creative ways. There are many different practices of Gaya, which I get into in the chapter, ways in which it was used for conflict resolution, ways in which young people will nowadays say it was our way of asserting our sovereignty. And I talk about the way that the people nowadays use it. There was an interesting event. I just showed you a picture of it before, but there's a contest in the national park. It was in order to get tourists to come, and they invited all of the different NGOs and churches and different associations to come and do a cultural performance. And there was a group that was really angry about that. And so they came wearing just these leaves. There's a picture of it in the book. And said, you're treating us like savages, so we're going to act like savages, and we're going to dress like this. And then they imitated headhunting, and then you could just see that the park administrators were very upset by this. Some of the other groups were as well, because they said they didn't take it seriously, but they were making a political point there, that the national park was built on their territory without their permission. So, and that's a way of talking, that's a way of using 出草, headhunting, Gaya as well. It's very interesting that now when there are protests on the streets, that indigenous people, because they have to speak in Chinese to speak to the indigenous people of other groups, they will say "Tsuta," and then they go on their demonstration. So it means let's go demonstrate in Taipei now. That's what it means. So it's kind of interesting. So anyway, another one is uduk. Uduk means spirit. Uduk Baro is the great spirit. It's God. Uduk Domino, the weaving spirit, also means God. So Uduk is spirits and it's gods and it's ghosts. And so the chapter on Uduk really is a reflection upon the changes that have happened in religion. And so I look at some of the traditional practices there. I talk about the shamanism. I talk about the one traditional ritual that is still ubiquitous in these communities now is the pig killing, which is called boulder Gaya, transit through Gaya. And basically, anytime a person goes through a transition stage, it's their rites of transition like Van Gennep wrote about, but anybody that goes through some kind of a change in their life, especially marriage, when they get married, they might kill 10 pigs. But once I observed somebody, I heard the sound of a pig, and it was in a backyard rather than the front yard, and it was one pig rather than 10, and they just had a divorce. And so for divorce, you would kill a pig as well. And so I wrote about that. And I was very interested in the conversion to Christianity, because most of them are Christian. And so I go through the three different churches that are very big in their communities. So there's the Roman Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the True Church of Jesus Christ. And so talk about those and the differences between them. So for example, the Catholic Church is more syncretic. The shamans, I only got to meet two shamans. The shamans have passed away, or both Roman Catholic. One of them, the one who gave me my name, also gave me some good understandings of the relationship between traditional religion and Christianity. That people have different ways of looking at it. Some people see that within the village, we should be Christians, and then we go into the forest and we go back to the traditional ways. Some people see, so that's kind of a parallel world. Others see Christian God as above, and then the Uduk are below, and so there's an above and below, but people have different ways of looking at it. But I have some conversion stories in there, including one woman whose family was a family of very powerful shamans and headhunters, and then became Christian. And I also tell some interesting stories about how I encountered Uduk. So you'll have to read the book, I guess, to get to some of that. But my encounter with Uduk. So here we go. Gaya, this is the one thing they say is they've replaced the headhunting with hunting for animals, and you'll find that in the houses you often see a collection of animal heads now. If you had gone there 100 years ago, in fact, in the 1920s, there was National Geographic that had sent their team there and had pictures of skull racks, of human skulls in front of people's homes. Nowadays, you'll see animal heads discreetly placed in people's homes. And then Uduk, here's an example of one of the sacrifices of a pig. And in this case, it was a happy moment. There was a stream conservation project that had been successfully completed, and so they did that. Any happy, important moment is a time for a pig sacrifice. And in fact, in the first village where I did my research for a 6-month period, and I said to them, as a researcher, I would like to give something back to the community. So what would you like me to do? And he said, kill a pig. So satsu. So that's what I ended up doing, was purchasing a pig, and then we shared it in the community. And then I did the same in the second community. And it was only in the third year that I was able to bring myself to actually participate in the sacrifice and be one of the one of the people who hold down the pig while the man who is very skilled puts the knife into the throat of the pig. So anyway, that's a reflection on Uduk. I think that the next two chapters, this one is Lunglungan. Lunglungan means the heart, but we're not talking about the physical heart of the body. We're talking really about the heart as a seat of ethical reflection. And so I had this is a chapter in which I look at the politics of indigeneity. And, I talk about how people start the day. Often they wait in the village while a gongto will come and pick them up in a truck, and then they go and work somewhere. And so I spent a lot of time hanging out in those grocery stores. But there was this question of how do they relate to social movements? Like Igong Shiban Tianchun, who was one of the first Durugu people I met, and the one who said to me, you must come to my village and work with the Durugu on this Asia cement issue. So she brought me into this in the very beginning. So I knew her since about the year 2000. But then I found that there was really a question in the village about whether or not people should support people like Igong. And so there's a lot of ethical reflections on that, about whether or not to join social movements, lots of reflections about which candidates to support in elections, which are very public events in indigenous communities. Generally, when it's the electoral campaign period, all of the candidates will have their teams of people who go around the township, around the villages with trucks, and it's very rambunctious, and they're handing out brochures, and there will be big banquets, and it can be very difficult for people to decide which candidate to support. They both might have kin relations with two different people. They tend to be very strong supporters of the KMT, but within the KMT, there are also differences of opinion and so forth. And so this is really a chapter about the politics of indigeneity. And there were a number of issues. The Asia cement is one of them. And so this is a protest at the Taroko National Park against Asia cement. Basically, it began with a case of fraud when Asia Cement applied to use territory on their land. And so the township, they asked people to sign, because they have usufruct rights, they don't have private property, to sign off the plot of land. Some of them didn't do it, but the township came up with their stamps, with their chops anyway, and a signature. And so they were defrauded, some people, some families. And then Igong found out when she came back from Japan, and she started to investigate it. And then the environmental groups helped her out with that. And so there's really the question about, should one get involved with that or not? And a lot of people decide not to. And in fact, much more recently, when it came up to, should Asia Cement continue mining there was actually a referendum in the village. And having spent so much time there, I was not at all surprised when they voted in majority to keep the mine. But these are all ethical considerations that they have to make. And actors like Asia Cement are very good at playing with that. So I talked there in that chapter as well about the movement for name rectification, 正名运动, in which they get to claim their own names. So some of these Atayal people, they decided they're Durugu, and then some of them became Sediq, and in both communities there was some people who were for and some people who were against the change. So it's really a question of carefully listening to a lot of people and how they reflect ethically with their heart, all trying in their own way, even if it's not the way I might do things, in their own way to live according to Gaya. And, being an autarkic community where everybody is equal, there's actually quite a lot of respect for difference of opinion. And then there's Dominun. And I think it's very important to show respect here for they often say that the men hunt and the women weave. And so the work of the women, but Dominun is also used in the sense of Dominun Gari Ludan, weaving together the words of the ancestors, the way in which they tell stories. And so this becomes a chapter about social memory, and in particular about in Hualien, how the Tailuga Sijian, the Taroko incident or the battle for Taroko became a really important source of identity, and in Nantou, the Musha incident or the Musha uprising. And so it's about how the history is told and then it takes concrete form in commemorative monuments and so forth. So I think that kind of skips across the chapters. It's like throwing a stone into the water and letting it skip across. There's an awful lot that I haven't been able to go into, but that's kind of what the themes of those 5 chapters are. But, what does it all mean? And I think that it comes to that there are these people in Taiwan, far away from here, right? On the other side of the ocean, up in the mountains there, and they have a legal system called Gaya. And it really is the heart of their life to this day. They live in communities they call alam, and the communities still are the center of their ethical reflection. It's really the important part of their identity. Trying to think about how to live fairly and equitably with other people in their community and sharing with one another. That's what the hunting is about too. The biggest part of the hunting, it's not about killing animals. It's about coming back with the blessings of the ancestors and sharing with members of one's alam. It's about being together. And they often make a lot of criticisms of our contemporary society. I find that they have a lot of things to teach us. I talked about the indigeneity here, so these legal ways of being indigenous with the names of 16 different groups and township politics and everything. But indigenous resurgence is the way, and this is happening in a big way, in which indigenous people and peoples are affirming themselves, writing literature, making films, talking to anthropologists, having ordinary conversations about taking a new place in the world and really kind of helping to make the world a better place. That's what a lot of it's about. So I cited here from the book by Bawan Danach, who went high up into the mountains to interview Abai Kumu, who was 105 years old. And I like the citation that she had. So I translated it into English and put it in the last chapter here. But she said, from ancient times to the present, Turugu lives were self-sufficient because of hunting and growing millet. Without depending on the outside world, we lived like that for thousands of years. Just by obeying Gaya, we could live from our surroundings, taking wild plants and fruits and eat to our full. Nowadays, modern people seem to have material conditions, life quality, and a space for activities, all 100 times greater than in our generation. But I get the general impression that they are missing something by losing the respect for the ancestral spirits and taking a foreign religion as the basis of life. Gaya is the alam and the mutual interdependence and order that arises within it, so unquote. And I think it's a very profound way in which some Sediq, whether they're Turugu, Dekadai, or Toro, but many Sediq people, and I know for sure that other groups in Taiwan are thinking the same. There's these intellectuals coming out who are really reflecting very seriously about the lifestyle that the general society has embraced and where we should be going as Sediq Balai, as truly human. So that's the book, really summarizing it quickly. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, go ahead, Ian.
Speaking on indigenous thinking and what's happening in Taroko, I was wondering some of the experience you had and how the indigenous peoples are grappling with what's happening with the mounting tourism within the gorge itself, their thoughts, their feelings, how that feels to them in their experience with their land.
Yeah. So tourism, this is a big swath of Taiwan, actually, the Taroko National Park. And it is one of Taiwan's main tourist attractions. There's no question about that. And so there are debates unresolved still in the community about tourism. I think they will never be resolved because there are different interest groups involved. There are some critical perspectives, obviously from people who are not involved in the industry itself. People who feel as if their lives are disturbed, and they told me about things that happen. So for example, there's a sign to some archaeological site where there's nothing there for them to see, but they go looking for it and they traipse through people's yards and look in people's houses, and people find that offensive. Some people are disturbed that there's a tendency for these tourist buses to come into the village at the foot of the park, stop at the 7-Eleven or the gas station, and then continue on their way into the park. And so the village at the foot of the mountain there, the park there, has really no, a few places as families try to offer accommodations. It's not often very successful. There is a hotel and a restaurant, again, owned by outsiders. Local restaurants usually don't attract tourists. So that particular place, there's not that much interest. And sometimes the township tries to impose rules on them, which they don't like. So when I was doing research there in the beginning of around 2005, there was the township wanted them to have a village contract in order to take care of tourists. We're going to eliminate all of the bad habits that the tourists dislike. So you're going to keep your dogs at home, tied up in your yard. Don't raise roosters anymore because they make noises in the morning. So your chicken raising habits have to change. No more pig killings because the tourists don't like being wakened at 4 o'clock in the morning by the sound of pigs being killed. So they tried unsuccessfully to make all kinds of rules that people just ignored. That being said, there are also people who embrace tourism and try to make it in their own way. There is a hotel in the park called Buruan, which seems like one that would be very easy for an anthropologist to be very critical of. But I've hesitated because I know that the people who are dancing and singing really enjoy their jobs dancing and singing, and they really embrace that. And so there's that. I know those people very well. Further up the mountain, there's an ecotourism NGO and a handful of families that actually love to take these tourists up there, small scale, so it's ecotourism. There's a difference between tourism and then tourism and ecotourism. But they love to take up groups of people, often groups of university students, and they've taken my students up there 3 times. And the attraction for quite a while was that you could go there for the original lifestyle without running water or electricity. And now they have solar panels. But they have really embraced that particular groups of families tourism, and they set up an NGO in which you could sign up for a family that would take care of you through that NGO. But it's been, tourism is really an arena for political conflict, and people have lots of different opinions about it. So.
Do you see a lot of pinglang used? And oftentimes I see a cigarette, pinglang, and wine or something on the road, on stop, a rock or something. Does that mean something at all?
Yeah, so pinglang is the betel nut, for those who might not know. But it's the betel nut, it's the biggie in Telugu language. And it's a nut wrapped up. They wrap it up in leaves usually, and so it's something that truck drivers like in Taiwan because it's a pick me up. It's like getting a strong coffee. It's grown in the south. I was doing my research in the north. But especially in Hualien, and there were lots of betel nut stands on the road there. And they have learned to use the betel nut with cigarettes and rice wine as their sacrifices. So if you saw that on a rock on an entry to the forest, it could very well be that somebody made a sacrifice there.
I'm recently doing a research about the Musha incident, how the social studies textbook in Taiwan portray this incident and how the Sedic people are misrepresented. So I'm like really curious about how you talk about the Musha incident in your fifth chapter.
Okay, that's great. That's how much time do we have? This is really a very big issue. And I did my research in Grupan, which is where the survivors are. And so that really colors my understanding of it. But for those who don't know I guess I should kind of say what this is. This is what happened beginning on October 27th, 1930. And the Japanese convoked everybody, all the Sedic people, to come to the town of Musha. And they saw Musha as being like the model of a successful indigenous village, Baran. And they really wanted to show off. And that particular day was a day to commemorate a Japanese prince who had died in 1895 when they had a battle in Tainan. I learned that. And so it was a very important thing in the local Shinto practice. They wanted to bring everybody together, so all of the school children were there. And there were 12 Sedic groups, and some people went around and under the leadership of Mona Luda, but there were others, and got 6 of them to agree to rise up against the Japanese. And they were very upset with the Japanese for a number of reasons. So anyway, when the flag was going up, they attacked. And then the Japanese, so the first Usa incident, I don't like that word, but the first one is when they attacked, and then the Japanese had these military reprisals, including using chemical warfare. And then the second Usa incident is when they put them in, the Japanese put the survivors into a detention camp, and then they got the Doda people to attack the people who were in detention and couldn't leave. And so there were more casualties there. And then the final survivors were moved to Kawanakashima, the island in the middle of the river, which is Guruban or Qingnyo Pulo. And so Mona Luda didn't really have any children, but then, this is he didn't have any children that survived. His son was, of course, Dada Mona was there, but that is the village of the survivors. And so I spent a lot of time there and up and down there in Nantou. And in the book, I kind of look at what happened there, but I also explore the different perspectives that people have on that history. And in Guruban, people tend to look at Dada Mona as a hero who rose up against the Japanese. What's interesting, I discussed quite a bit the work of Gumu Dabas, because it's really engaging with indigenous authors. And she has her own perspective because she is part Torugu, part Doda, and lives up in the higher mountains there. And so she talks a lot about the women's perspective. And I think that some of the women in Guruban even, I was told not to ask any questions about Musha incident because people are tired of talking about it, but not asking questions, people still talked about it. And I found that some people were like, especially women, were like, well, I'm not quite sure if Mona Luda was a hero or not. And, maybe we wouldn't have suffered so much if he hadn't done that. Maybe we wouldn't have had to go through all of that tragedy in that history. And so many people died. And so, again, there's a lot of complexity there. But they've woven it into a story and made a film by Weda Sangino. it's a new way of looking at it. It was always a part of nationalist propaganda. They said it was a anti-Japanese uprising and for the Republic of China, which Mona Luda probably didn't care about at all. But there's a reclaiming of it. But in the villages, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what it means. Another dimension that I find interesting is that people will still bring it up. There was a sign, for example, where some outsiders had wanted to take over some land, and the sign said, "Don't forget, we are the people of the Musha incident." So that's there, and sometimes they've said that they like there was a hearing about hunting rights in the national park, and somebody stood up and said to the policeman, "Do you want to have another Musha incident?" So they will bring it up, but it's a living part of history there, and so that's what the Minun is all about, weaving it into history, but weaving history into modern life.
What is the health of these indigenous communities populations? Have we seen, is there trends where they're moving to more cities? Is that pretty stable? Just curious about, I think you mentioned 10,000 maybe in one community or group. Just curious in general speaking.
Okay, generally speaking, in Taiwan, over half of the indigenous people live in the cities. And if you were to look at because the different groups there's the biggest group is the biggest distinction is that between the mountain groups and the plains groups. The mountains groups have reserve land. So they have a little bit more incentive to stay in their own communities. And I think that there's less movement outwards. But and also I think there's a tendency in some places for people to come back now. So if you're talking about health in the sense of how many people are still living there, I would say that there's some population decline, but I wouldn't say that it's a critical crisis in the areas that I was in. That's also because they can conveniently get to other places. So from Garupan, they can get to Taichung in an hour, and they often do to work there. Like every day, there are trucks of people going out there. And in Hualien, of course, they're close to Hualien City, where there's lots of construction. So yeah, there's still families with their children in every place I've been. Even the higher ones, they are so busy with tea cultivation that people are still there. So.
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry. Like, as an anthropologist, do you feel like, because I feel like in the States, they talk about a lot of like native or indigenous nations, while in Taiwan, do you feel like this concept is brought up?
Yeah. So the question about indigenous nationhood, and yes, it is brought up. I don't think that everybody is on board with it, but people who are involved in the indigenous movement, especially the Presbyterian movements. There's also the Hunters Smoke Action League, but there's definitely a movement about talking about nationhood. And in fact, I know a lot of people don't do this, but I do know one person talks about Sediq so Sediq Nation. And one time with somebody else, when we were going up the mountain, you come to this place called Guan, which means the barrier where people stop. It was an old name for it. And he said that this is the national boundary of the Sediq Nation. So yeah, there is an incipient idea of nationhood. That being said, I just started my talking with the elder person who doesn't like that idea. And it says we're all humans, and so they shouldn't be using that for just one ethnic group. And so, again, there's a lot of ethical debates.
Hi. Very, very interesting. Could you say a little bit about identification? That is, how do people determine their status vis-a-vis one of the indigenous groups? And is there kind of policing by the groups themselves, that is policing of identity? And is the state involved in determining identity or enforcing it in any way?
Yeah,
Just a bunch of overlapping questions.
yeah, that's a big question. When Awi Mona, the legal scholar from the Sediq, and I just finished writing an article about that actually, because there was another constitutional decision made about identity. Basically, what it works is that I think that in most indigenous villages, it's not problematic because there's a household registration office where people have to take care of their hukal, their registration and births and marriages and deaths and so forth. And so they just go and register and they have to tell which group they're in. And so that's fairly straightforward there. Where it's not so straightforward is...
Let me just stop you there. Is there a fixed menu of groups, or can people just say anything they want and put it in the household register?
Yeah, there's a menu. So it's the 16 groups. What I find interesting is that if you look at the population statistics, one of the largest number of people is the refuse to give a name. So they're just indigenous without being a part of a group. That's one of the largest categories. It's after Amis and Bunun and so forth, but it's bigger than the Lukai, for example. But where it becomes more of an issue is in urban areas. So that, if you're in Sholing where everybody is Turugu, then it's pretty much you're Turugu. Some people hold out and they insist on being Sediq or even a Tayang. But then when you get into the urban areas, there's not that same community there. And there's a lot of intermarriage as well. And so basically the court case that came up was because according to, it's all regulated by the state, but according to the law before, that if a person has an indigenous parent and a non-indigenous parent, if they want to have the right to have indigenous status, they have to use an indigenous name. And the reason for that was because the indigenous activists and lawmakers thought that people with indigenous names are more likely to have a stronger attachment to indigenous identity. And so they want to encourage that. But the court decided that this is unconstitutional. It violates their freedom. It was actually a case of a non-indigenous man who wanted to keep his family line in the Chinese way with an indigenous wife. And they decided the courts decided that it should be the decision of the people themselves. And so you can't impose on them, they have to have an indigenous name. And so that gets to the point that it's actually the state that's deciding who's indigenous or not. And even though there are 16 officially recognized groups, none of those are legal persons in the sense of a band council that we know, or a tribe in the United States that would have their own membership role. And so the state does that.
Thank you.
Maybe as this follow-up to Bill's question, there is a power structure and hierarchy among all the different tribes in Taiwan. So obviously the largest tribes, so they have greater political representation. So does that come into play in terms of how is there sort of competition among the different tribes that are defined by their identification?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. The political representation, especially at election time.
Right.
In the legislative UN, there are two different electoral roles for indigenous voters. There's the mountain people and the plains mountain people became mountain indigenous and plains indigenous. The Amis would have a lot of political power on that plain side, because there's so many of them. The smaller groups rarely get elected. So it tends to be, because people like to vote for their own group, So yes, the Amis have a lot of political power. The Atayalic groups tend to support one another. So Atayal and Sediq and Truku, they tend to support one another in election time. And then, Taiwan, they would have a fairly good. So yeah, the smaller groups are really marginalized in terms of participation in the legislative union.
So this is the city identification result in some. You say that they tend to support each other.
Yeah.
Right? So it doesn't matter that whether they identify with
Yeah, so like Kong Wenji, for example. So because he's from Lusan,
Yeah.
so his dialect is Turugu. But he's from Lusan, which is in Renai Xiang, the Renai township. So that's where the 3S Confederation is. And so he is able to get Turugu votes from Hualien because he speaks the same dialect. And he's able to get the Sediq votes in Nantou. And he's also quite good at getting Atayal votes because, they have that history of being Atayal. And so he's quite good at that. So they tend to support him.
Okay.
Also, Gao Jin Sume is one of the other ones.
Right.
So, yeah. Yes, Bill?
Yeah. Are there any rights or privileges that pertain to indigenous status or to any particular tribe?
Yeah, so I think there's a perception that they get some special rights, like adding points to exams and so forth. But I think that in terms of their own experience, there's more of an experience of discrimination. So there's a perception from outside. I think we did the same thing here.
I'm actually thinking, I was surprised that there's no right to hunt. You mentioned hunting, and I was just wondering if there are any such rights, of fishing or hunting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so hunting, for example, is a good example of a special right, because there are exceptions to the rules for hunting. And the hunting is illegal, trapping is illegal, but exceptions are made only for indigenous people. And there was another court case that's in the article that Avi and I wrote, but there are exceptions for indigenous people who are permitted to hunt under certain circumstances. Number one, they have to make their own hunting rifles. They have to use so-called traditional hunting rifles. They're handmade, that are very dangerous to use because the gunpowder can explode in the wrong way. People have to get injured in their face or eyes or fingers. They're not necessarily the best way to shoot at an animal effectively either. One time I was with a guy that I wasn't with him when it happened, but he shot one of the mountain goats, and the bullet bounced off its head. So, and it fell unconscious, and so he brought back a live animal. But these are not necessarily the most effective or safe guns, but that's one of the requirements that they have to do. That upsets them very much. Number two, they're only allowed to hunt if it's for cultural purposes. And so simply going out for food purposes or subsistence is not enough. They have to prove there's some cultural reason. And generally at the township or county level, it's interpreted as there's this list of rituals, and you have to tick it off the box of which one you're doing. And thirdly, before they go hunting, they have to go to the township office and fill out a form indicating when they're going to hunt, where, which animal they're going to catch, which is impossible to know in advance, and why. So you have to give the cultural reason, which particular ritual you're doing. And then fourthly, even if they follow all of that, they're not allowed to take the animal they want, because there's a whole list of protected species that they're not allowed to take. So there are exceptions that permit indigenous people to hunt that still mean that most hunting activities are criminal acts.
So I think listening to you talk about the Sediq, the term actually means human, and I cannot help but recall the same applies to Dawood, also on Woki Island, and I was actually there at the time when they started the process of kind of self-identification began, but that didn't come up as a question at all. They just switched from Yamis to Dawood right away. And maybe because part of this had to do with the fact they were named wrongly in the beginning. For that story. And I wonder if that I mean, does that apply to other groups as well, or is this just unique to this region?
Yeah, I think that actually a lot of the groups, the name means human.
Right.
So, Bunun,
Mhm.
Thao,
Mhm.
Tao,
Right.
Tao means, and Sediq. So a lot of them do. Dayan does too, Ataya.
Mhm.
Some of them are not. Bangzai is, but Amix is not. I
Right,
think.
right. Mhm.
So a lot of them just mean human.
But does that question ever come up with the other groups in terms of is this so the identity confirmation or just the term that they use? To describe themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a case that comes up when they're looking for new names.
Yeah.
So it came up with Sediq because the Japanese called them Dayan, Ataya.
Mhm.
But in the Sediq 3 dialects, none of them call themselves Dayan or anything that even sounds like that. They call themselves Sediq for Daya,
Mhm.
Sediq for Doda, and Sejek for Drogo. And so they got 3 different ways of saying it, but none of them have anything to do with Dayan. So there's the question there of if they break away from Ataya, then what's the right word? And they had a lot of discussions about that. And Sediq was one of the options. But yeah, so it came up then.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of compare
Yeah.
these different experiences.
Yeah, even when I was in Orchid Island in 2019,
Mhm.
some people, I mean, there's lots of disagreements in these communities. Some people told me they don't want to be called Tao. They like yummy.
Mhm.
Ah. And so my MA student, she wrote her thesis calling them yummy because the first person she met told her we're not Tao, we're yummy.
Yeah, I mean, it may have to do with the ones who are advocating for Tao.
Yeah,
They belong to a particular faction on the island,
Yeah.
which are seen as they don't get along quite well with
Yeah.
others.
yeah,
So it's more of a political choice.
yeah. So one of the things about doing long-term ethnographic research is you get to know all of the factions and you get to hear all of the perspectives. And if you're willing to talk to everybody, it's yeah. So you get to kind of see how it's very complex.
It is.
Ian, any questions from online? No? Okay. Well, maybe I could ask a question then.
Okay.
I wanted to ask more about the chapter relating to the constitutional ruling. What do you think is the kind of way out to, I shouldn't say way out, but what would the indigenous community say in terms of like what was their preferred outcome for resolving the constitutional case? Do they prefer to have indigenous voices within the legal system, or do they actually prefer a different kind of pathway forward?
Yeah, I think there's actually a fairly good consensus there that, at least among Sediq and Durugu, that they are hunting on the hunting territories that belong to their families. Guluban's a bit different because they got moved there later, but but still they had. When they got there, they negotiated with the people who were using those territories, and they carved out their territories. And so I think that in all of these communities, there is a consensus that they know how to manage hunting. They know where their hunting territories are. They are capable of excluding outsiders from the territories of their particular clan. They have their own practices in which men will carve out paths, and then with their permission, younger people can go and shoot flying squirrels, for example. And I saw that these institutions that they have are there and they're working. And so I think that their solution would be to have the state step back and then to let them manage their own hunting territories and to create their own institutions to do so. And so they are willing to talk with like the national park and create some kind of a co-management regime or whatever, but they really see themselves as being capable of managing hunting. I think they're capable of doing that. They've been doing it for thousands of years.
Maybe one final question I will ask. So much of what we know about kind of Taiwan studies is really dictated from the position of pan-centrism.
Mm-hmm.
What do you suggest in terms of maybe a way to reform that perspective to center indigenous worldviews and epistemologies as well? Maybe thinking about speaking to people who don't specialize in indigenous studies.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I've been trying to do with all of these books about indigenous, really kind of turn around this instead of, as I say, just think about it as this island where these people have been for thousands of years and they're still there. I really dislike it when people talk about the Han society as being mainstream, because that's really a Han-centric way of looking at the world. But really to take the time to go and understand and listen and read and understand their perspective and see really an indigenous-centric perspective, it puts everything else in a different light, and helps us to see that Republic of China is colonial, but so is Taiwan, and they have, I think, very valuable perspectives that I thought it was worth spending over 20 years studying. So. And I think there's a lot more that we can do, and there's a lot of work already being done. I think that we often say we're standing on the shoulders of giants, but those giants are often the Sediq and Truku and Amis and Bulun people too, because they've got a lot to teach us. So, I'm quite willing to learn and just keep thinking with people and translating some of it into English. I think a lot of people want to help me because they want the world to know about their perspectives and the international world. They want these things to be published in English.
Maybe a follow-up question to that. I think especially with the history of anthropology, but then with so many current efforts to work on the community-based level and to be acknowledge that indigenous communities are the knowledge holders or something. Particularly with young scholars, I guess, what you've learned as being an anthropologist trying to pursue this methodology that you have been.
I think that there's a big industry of anthropology, really, and all of these communities, especially those that are close to universities, are just inundated with students wanting to write their theses, and there's a lot of concern, at Utali's film, Voices of Orchid Island, this comes up in the very beginning. There's a lot of concern that they come there, they get some data, there's a lot of extractivism going on, and then they go off and make their career. In fact, I think they're more extractivists than the mining companies, because the mining companies at least give them employees, get something back. But there's a lot of concern about that. And when I ask them, what they want from me, the number one thing that they say is, we want you to come back again and again and again and take a concern for our well-being. And this should not be about you, and this should not be about your career. And I have been very fortunate that I have the conditions that have allowed that to happen that way. I understand there are people who go and write their master's thesis or PhD thesis and never go back because they never got an academic job that let them go back. But they really dislike those anthropologists that don't even spend the night in the village too. They come and do some interviews and then leave. And so they really are happy with the anthropologists who eat what they eat, who drink with them, who spend long times in the village, who work and do things with them. I think they really appreciate it. They adopted me.
Okay, I think that's a nice note to end on. So thank you so much, Professor Simon. Once again, truly human, Toronto Press, out in just a few weeks. So look forward to reading it and encourage everyone else to read it as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.